What if I told you that chest presses don't train the triceps? Well, you might rightfully say, "Ben, that's a stupid thing to say," and I would agree. I would correct that to say some chest presses don't train the triceps, like the one that you're looking at right here. And today I want to explain exactly why that is. It's really going to come down to some basic physics concepts that seem to evade a lot of people. And I think that if you can understand these basic physics concepts and learn how to apply them across scenarios, you're going to not only understand exercise just so much better, but you're just going to be able to navigate the gym so much better. Okay. So why is it that the press that you are all looking at right here, which some of you might just immediately call a fly, doesn't actually train the triceps? Well, the simplest possible version of this, and I'm going to draw out a little diagram of this here in a second, is that the resistance of the cable is outside the elbow. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, the resistance of the cable is represented by this red arrow right here. And this red arrow right here, as well as this one over here, you can see a line so that they are on the outside of this joint right here and this joint right here, which we call the elbow. They're also on the outside of the shoulders on either side too. When we think about this from a shoulder perspective, what this really means is, okay, there's a force that's pulling the arm in this outward direction, right? And that outward direction, the fact that the resistance is pulling the arm this way, necessitates that we have to move this bone in the opposite direction. In other words, what is even allowing us to train our chest fibers, which span out in this direction, is the fact that there is a resistance that pulls in the opposite direction, right? Like much like if you're doing a biceps curl, right? You need a dumbbell or a cable or something that is straightening your elbow. To train the shoulder muscles here, we need something that's pulling the shoulder outward, okay? But from the perspective of the elbow, a lot of times what people do, like that can make sense a lot of times when we're looking at the shoulder, but when we're looking at the elbow, a lot of times people just see this elbow bending, elbow straightening thing, and they automatically assume, oh, because the elbow is straightening on the shortening portion, that must make it triceps. Well, let's talk about why that isn't true, at least from this perspective first. So if we think about the fact that, like, okay, the arm is getting pulled outward, we went over how that's relevant to the shoulder. How is that relevant to the elbow? Well, imagine that instead of doing a fly, okay, or a press, whatever you want to call this, I was doing a curl, a biceps curl. And imagine that I stopped in this position, right? Now, all of a sudden, it starts to maybe become a little bit more obvious to you all, right? Because if the resistance is pulling this way, imagine I were just keeping my arm perfectly still. I would basically just be doing a biceps curl where this bone was tracking back in this direction, and then where I would just do a curl in the opposite direction. Like you can imagine I would, be doing like a really kind of awkward, weird looking high cable curl there, but a cable curl nonetheless. Why would it be a cable curl? Well, because when the resistance falls this way and it falls in a direction which actually tries to straighten the elbow, muscles on this side of the joint, i.e. the biceps, the brachialis, and the brachioradialis, these are the muscles that need to contribute. So strangely enough, when I am performing this press, the thing that is allowing me to straighten my elbow is not my triceps. It's actually my chest pulling inward and my biceps and my other elbow benders controlling what I would call eccentric elbow extension. Okay, i.e., a simpler way to say that would be the lowering phase of a curl. Okay, now if we look at this from a different perspective, okay, because this may be more helpful, and we look at it like, imagine that we're looking at me from like, I don't know, top down, and we're doing some kind of press. Okay, so here's my head, here's my shoulder, here's my elbow, and let's just say my elbows. No, let's make it so that my elbow, oh, that was weird. Let's make it so that my elbows are kind of like this. Okay, they're like a little bit bent, right? All right, let's do that one again. You all are just going to see the raw mistakes here. All right, for whatever reason, this arm is way shorter, but we're just going to roll with it, okay? So imagine that red is me. We're looking at me from top down. And imagine we have some kind of cable that is pulling outward in this direction and pulling outward in this direction, okay? So this is like when I'm in the quote-unquote top of the press or the fly or whatever, and I'm like shrugging back and I'm about to go press. That's where I'm at right now. In order to identify the different forces on the elbow and shoulder, okay, what we have to do is we have to identify what's called moment arms. Okay, moment arm is basically just a distance that represents resistance in this case. So green right there is distance from the load direction, which would be a cable in this case, to the elbow. And then let's just imagine that the shoulder is here. Okay, it's not going to make much sense to do it this way, but stick figures are stick figures. Okay, so this distance is the distance to the shoulder. So you can see the distance to the shoulder is a lot longer than the distance to the elbow, over 2 times, okay, which makes sense. We're magnifying the distance to the shoulder, and because this is a stick figure representation, it looks bigger than it actually is, okay? But whatever. Basically, what these 2 moment arms are representing is the fact that this direction of force right here, let's pretend that was a good arrow, this direction of force right here is pulling the joints in this direction outward, right? Because for these distances to really have any impact and to mean anything, it means that this force right here is trying to influence these 2 bones in a particular direction. And so what this means is that if I'm doing a chest press that is, again, starting in this position and then ending up somewhere forward from this position, so if we sort of mark up what the end range position would be, so here's the shoulder, and let's just say here's the elbow, here's the shoulder, here's the elbow, right? We can still end up with a resistance that is kind of looking like this, all right? And then if we drag this way, like this. So if we end up with resistance, let's just delete all this stuff, in this direction, or in these blue directions, what you will recognize is that the relationship, if we draw those moment arm distances again, between these joints is actually the same. In other words, the resistance here is still outside the elbow, the resistance here is still outside the shoulder, and the shoulder distance is still greater than the elbow distance. So that's why this is more of a shoulder exercise than an elbow exercise. But if you actually look at this green line right here, what is that green line doing? What is it telling us? It's telling us that this blue line here is basically trying to pull this forearm in this direction. So if the forearm is being pulled outward in that direction, muscles that do the opposite of that, muscles, i.e. on the inside here, have to interact with the load. If this were a triceps press, this would look very different. So let's just move this aside for a second, move it here, and let's draw out what a triceps press would look like from above. So let's go to the lengthened position. Here's the head, here's the arms. Okay, let's just imagine that this person is, doing some kind of press. We don't have to name it. And let's say the resistance is in the blue. If the blue is in the hands here, here's what the resistance would need to look like in order for it to be a triceps press. Why? Well, if we remember our moment arm, i.e. our distance concepts, and we say, okay, here's now the distance to the elbow, here's now the distance to the shoulder. Shoulder is still bigger than elbow, but notice how in this representation here, this blue arrow right here, which represents the force, is on the inside of the elbow. So here's the elbow right here. This force is on the inside of that, which means that this force, because of this distance now that's moving inward rather than outward like we looked at over here, this distance being inward from the elbow means that this force right here is actually trying to bend the elbow. So when there's a force that is trying to bend the elbow, the muscles on the back, i.e. the triceps, need to straighten the elbow against it to some degree. But when there's a force like this on the outside of the elbow and it is trying to straighten the elbow, muscles on the inside need to contract. So ultimately, understanding how this press right here is a biceps and brachialis and brachioradialis involved motion rather than a triceps motion, to understand this is to not just understand those muscles individually, but to understand how resistance, how torque, all those things actually interact with our body to create this outcome that we call muscle contraction, to create this outcome that we call training this muscle in this scenario. And when you kind of try to oversimplify exercise and you just view exercises as distinct categories rather than individual things that fall along a spectrum of force on different joints, what you end up with is you end up making broad conclusions about an exercise like this where you say, oh, because press, that equals triceps. And in this case, that's incorrect for the reasons that we went over. And that may actually matter in an instance where we're actually looking to figure out, like, okay, well, if someone, for instance, has like a lot of triceps volume in their program, this would be a great selection maybe to pick as a variation before for, the day that you do triceps, right? So that the triceps are not fatigued going into the next day, right? Just as one silly example. Or maybe someone, whether it's you or a client, maybe they have elbow pain with triceps related concepts and you want to find a way to train chest without actually loading that joint action. Well, this is yet another application, right? If it were the opposite and biceps for whatever reason were a problem, then we would just be doing sort of quote unquote normal presses that involve more of the triceps. So on some level, some of you may think that this understanding this stuff is not super relevant until you start to bump into hard objects and recognize that, figuring out how to tweak different exercises is ultimately on some level going to be a matter of understanding the physics. And to understand the physics, you need to kind of be able to understand what all of this stuff even means in the first place. So I hope this dissection was useful in terms of seeing the visuals. If you want to learn more from me, this is my free community. You can join it for free. We have over 2,000 members in here, and you can make a post, you can ask questions, and I might even turn those questions into a video like the one that you're seeing now. So I hope you all enjoyed this. Please join the free community at the link below. You also have this classroom section with a bunch of free content, free stuff here, Q&A recordings. So check it out if you want to learn more from me, and I'll see you all, as always, in the next one.